Hello, great souls. So good to be with you today. Let's begin together with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, great masters of self-realization, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Shri Yukteswar, and Paramahansa Yoganandaji, saints of all religions, we humbly bow to you now. Friend and guide, Swami Kriyananda, be with us as we study these teachings. Help us, Divine Masters, to see the truth that these teachings offer us and to have the grace to apply them to our life and to our journey. Help us to awaken to our own divine potential and to be channels of thy divine grace to all. Om. Peace. Amen. Okay, so today we're looking at the quality, the niyama of tapasya. It's also referred to as austerity. And again, I'm reading and drawing upon the teachings in Raja Yoga, in the Art and Science of Raja Yoga. It's a very nice resource for this. So I'm going to read a little bit from the book and then we'll talk about it. Tapasya, or austerity, is not a popular word in the West. To the Westerner, a contented life means one that is cluttered with the so-called good things: television, fine clothes, the best of foods, the latest in transportation. But these things, as we've already said, rob us of contentment. The more distractions a person has, the more empty he feels in his heart. It is necessary to weed, indeed to thrust out of one's life the distractions that reach out coaxingly from every billboard and from the dancing eyes of people who still hope to find their fulfillment in things. There is a certain amount of sternness necessary if one is to stem the outward pulling tide. The artist knows that unless he can channel his energies, he will not be able to create things of lasting beauty. Patanjali says that from this redirection of one's energies from external matter to the inner self, one develops certain powers. Once these powers, no longer spilled and wasted out on the sands of matter, are gathered and directed one-pointedly by consciousness, we are able to come into full command of the self. I think I'll end there. There's so much I could read. I'm just looking at it and realizing. Let me just start with that, because that's quite a lot in and of itself. So austerity, and I'm going to go right back to what I was saying, what the book was saying, is part of the practice is having the command of our energy and being able to direct the flow of energy in a concentrated, focused way. And so to apply ourselves, to apply our life toward an objective. In another context I've heard, in another book, I heard Swami talk about tapasya as the ability to be steadfast in our movement toward an objective without allowing anything to sway us from our commitment. So when we know that something is right and it feels dharmic, that's another term that we utilize in yoga practice. And dharma, I'll just say a little bit about that. Dharma is sometimes referred to as right action. And when we're talking about right action, we're talking about activities or actions that expand our consciousness. So the result of the action is that you feel expanded in yourself. You feel more connected to your highest truth. You feel more connected to one of the 8 manifestations of God that Yogananda talks about. So a greater sense of peace, a greater sense of calmness. You might feel a sense of power, right? Tapasya and austerity, this ability to say no to the wrong thing and yes to the right thing, really does awaken a tremendous amount of access to the inner power and access to divine grace. Yogananda had a charming phrase that he used, which was develop won't power. Learn to say I won't to those things that do not serve you in your journey. The other aspect of it that it talks about in Raja Yoga is, there can be a solitary quality to our journey. And in Tapasya and austerity, there are certain moments as we move forward with right action, the right thing to do. So oftentimes Tapasya comes up when you're doing something and it feels a bit challenging, it feels a bit difficult. It takes energy, it takes commitment, it takes a sense of steadfast application of your will, right? And it's so I love that in the book it talks about, those with dancing eyes that are kind of alluring us, right? Or the billboards that coax us out with this idea that if I was doing something else, it would be more fun, right? Like this isn't so much fun. And so part of our practice with yoga, there's a spiritual maturity that happens as we learn how to say no to those things that are not serving us and say yes to the things that are. And we overcome what can seem, what Yogananda said, the right activity often can seem initially a little bitter, a little difficult, but in the end very, very sweet. And wrong activity is the reverse. It can seem sweet, right? It's tempting, it's tasty, but it's poisonous in the end. So being able to discern that. As I was preparing for today, I found myself reminded of a moment, and it was interesting. So I was in a training, and I was surrounded by people that I would have expected to be more like-minded. And in some ways we were like-minded. But at a point in the training, there was a break. People were resting and relaxing, and the conversation of the group was a group of women. It went in a direction that was very outward. It was very outward. And there was a lot of laughter, and it was one of those situations in which it seemed like we were all having a good time. But I noticed that the longer that the conversation continued, the more I wasn't resonating with it. It wasn't resonating for me. So I didn't contribute. I didn't have anything to say. And when at a certain point I excused myself, which was fine, I was able to kind of discreetly say, well, I'm going to go back to my room and rest now, and I'll see you all later. It was an extended training, so I would be with all these people. And as I was walking back to my room, the thought came to me, I feel so low, right? I noticed my energy. I mean, I was in a training I was actually loving. So my energy had been up, but the way that everyone was engaging in conversation with this outward focus during our break, it redirected the flow of my energy. And so at first, what I was feeling was different. At first, I was feeling other, like, oh, they're all having a good time. They're all enjoying this conversation, and they're now even beginning to talk about things that I don't do, right? They just started talking about things that I don't practice and that I didn't practice at that time. And so I was feeling outside a bit. Right? Well, the other thing, as I said, is I noticed as I walked back to my room, my energy was low. And so I was walking and I just said, I feel so low. And then as soon as I heard myself say that in my mind, those two things came together, and it was solo. It was like, oh, solo. I feel by myself, right? But somehow there was an awareness of solitary, right, and solitude. And solitude, there is an aspect of the spiritual journey in which we practice and experience solitude. And making peace with that can be incredibly empowering. I know for myself, Yogananda said seclusion, one of his famous quotes, is that seclusion is the price of greatness. And I practice seclusion regularly. One of my spiritual practices is to practice seclusion 1 day a week. So one day a week, for me it's on Wednesdays, I take a day of silence and seclusion. And that's a day for me to really spend and dedicate my self to being as aligned and connected with God as possible. And there are various things I can do. I mean, it can be a creative, playful day, and God's my playmate that day. And so I do a creative, fun project with no sense of, there's no working. So anything that I do, it's very clear that I'm not working. I'm very grateful to enjoy the work that I do. I serve Ananda full time. So there's a lot of creativity in the work that I do, in the service and seva. But on seclusion, I don't work. So every once in a while, I admit, I will be so inspired by ideas, because it happens when we're quiet like that and we're attuning ourselves to God, to the masters. A lot of creative ideas will come through. So every once in a while, I just write them all out. If they come through, I get out a clipboard, I just pour it all out, and then I put it aside. I'm not going to work on it, but I will capture it, because I can sense that it's inspired. I can feel the difference. And so I do that, and then I appreciate it, but I put it to the side, because seclusion is about inner communion and taking time to be alone with God and explore what Yogananda called the divine romance. So finding my own way of relating to and hearing God. I recently purchased a beautiful book that is often talked about in Ananda circles. It's Swamiji talked about this. And these are the letters of a modern mystic, the letters of Frank Laubach. He was a minister that traveled, a missionary that traveled to the Philippines. And ultimately, there's a beautiful story about him, but he developed a practicing of the presence of God. And these are letters about that practice. So I was reading it recently and just appreciating, and it's really for me one of a beautiful thing to do in seclusion, because it's about inner communion, as I said. So Tapasya, austerity, is saying no to something. And that's what I do on seclusion. Seclusion, I draw the strong boundaries around what I don't do. Right? So no texting, no emailing, no working, no social interaction, as much as possible. And when I say that, every once in a while I'll go on a bike ride. It's a little tricky. I tend to not leave where we live on seclusion, because it's difficult to not engage in any way with people. I did find that, so I actually have a little notepad that I carry with me that I can write "I'm in silence," in case someone's trying to connect with me or talk with me. So there's little tricks that you use, but that's what I mean by as much as possible. But mostly, and in the community, if I'm out and about now with shelter in place, I don't go out as much around in our beautiful community, a little bit. But with wearing masks, there's this kind of a natural distance already that's happening. But the idea is that I'm saying no to that alluring energy of the world that wants to draw me out. And it's so magnetic that there can be a feeling that I need to be involved, I need to be engaged, when it's not true. It's really not true. And part of what seclusion does for me is it reminds me every week that there is a divine force, a force that I call God, in charge of everything, navigating the planets, navigating, just holding, just orchestrating all the things that don't need me to be doing anything to continue going. And so once a week I practice reminding myself, I can relax, I can let go. And in that letting go, I'm nourished. And that really is the practice of Tapasya. I've told this story, I think, in one of these series before, but it's so meaningful to me, I just feel to tell it again. And this is of a dear friend, Vivekadevi, who, for me, there was a moment in her seva that epitomizes Tapasya and austerity and the gifts that it brings. She was doing the altar, so she did a beautiful altar here, and it was for Krishna. And so it was quite elaborate. It was one of the altars that was really stunning. I have a beautiful altar behind me right now. That the altars here, they're so inspiring, and this one was beautiful and inspiring. And so she had done all the work, spent a lot of time doing it. It's very intricate work. And it's a beautiful practice of seva. So she did that, and then this was on she did this on a Friday. That night was a kirtan, Krishna kirtan. The next day, and she partly did it for the kirtan, but she was doing it for Sunday service. So there were a few events in which the altar would play a part. So her plan was on Saturday was to come in and switch out the candles that would have been used for the kirtan. And when she came in the next morning, so maybe 10 minutes, just kind of run over, put new candles in, all done, the altar had been rearranged. And so you'd have to really, well, maybe you don't have to have, I think you can sense. I could, because I've done enough kinds of things like that. And I've also helped Vivekadevi and Atmajyoti with altars. It's a big deal when the altar gets moved. Everything has been put together so precisely. Well, she knew when she looked at it, it wasn't a 10-minute job. It was going to take quite a while, and it did. And so the Tapasya moment was how she was going to approach it, right? Was she going to step into the service with a spirit of joy and seva and surrender, and still with a lot of dynamic energy, a lot of commitment to the project to say, all right, because the temptation is to fall back, like, oh, no, right? And it was there. There was a moment of, oh, no. And she chose to rise. So she rose to the task, she rose to the moment. And in that rising, she dedicated herself and got lost in the practice of creating a new altar. It was basically what happened is she created a whole new altar. And she told me later that at the end, towards the very end, hours later after doing that, and she was filled with so much joy and bliss from the experience, she realized the gift that had been given to her. Right? So what seemed in a moment when she saw, oh no, a whole nother day, right? She had already given a whole day to it the day before, a whole nother day is going to be required to create an altar for the Sunday service the next day. By the end of the day, she could experience so much joy and peace and grace that she said, it suddenly came to her, Divine Mother wanted to spend another day with her. So that's what had happened. Things had been orchestrated so that she would have to spend another day in seva. And because she knew how to show up with austerity, okay, well, whatever I thought else I was going to do today, I'm not going to do. Today, this is what I'm going to do. The mastery, the command of the self to make that choice is the very thing that allowed her to be receptive to the grace that was flowing to her. And that became an incredibly deep practice. And this is what Tapasya offers us. So when we say no to the wrong thing, and we say no with an application of our consciousness and our energy of yes, so I will, so we have the combination, I won't do that, I will do this. There is I have this practice, and I have a teacher who talks about this very practice in terms of choosing healthy eating and healthy food. And one of the things that she encourages people when they're changing their diet and working with that, to be very careful in the way they hold it. If they hold it as kind of, oh, I don't get to do that anymore, right? Well, you're saying won't, but you're saying it in such a way that your energy isn't on board. You're not really on board with it. You're doing it. But it isn't tapasya. She doesn't use that language, but because I know yoga, I can see that she's talking about tapasya and austerity. And what she said is find a way to claim it with an energy that says, this is what I do. Right? This is my choice. I'm choosing to do this. And that's what that day, what Kamaladevi did. Like she had the moment of encountering, okay, wow, this is what's ahead of me. How are we going to choose it? And the moment that she committed her energy to it and said, okay, very well, this is what I'm doing, the grace came to her. So this is part of what we look at in Tapasya. It's interesting. I started with that story of being with these women, and it suddenly wasn't the right environment anymore. In the training itself was perfect for me. And they were all on, pretty much on board with the training. So in that setting, it was all good. But after that, I became very careful with that group. Like, okay, after class, maybe just go on a walk by myself. Just be careful, pay attention. Where's the energy going? That's Tapasya. There was a part of me, Yogananda calls this the familial warmth. Like in a social setting, we can feel, and that's where the attraction comes in. Like, in one way, it felt good to be relaxing and hanging out and laughing, but what they were talking about, wasn't uplifting for me. And so the tapasya that I practiced the rest of that training, the austerity is it was better to be alone in certain situations than to engage in the wrong company. And good company is part of our practice in yoga. Paying attention, what am I reading? What am I listening to? Who am I spending time with? Where am I dedicating myself? There was a teacher I heard talk about, and this was something that happened in his life. His teacher asked him, look at the 5 people that you spend the most time with and ask yourself, do they carry the consciousness that you want to have? Because they are influencing you. And this is part of what we look at in Tapasya, are our choices, our decisions. What are we doing and how am I doing it? So learning to find a sense of upliftment, and that's really what I was challenged with on that day. I was walking away first feeling so low. I feel so low. I was feeling a little bit sad, a little different, a little on my own. And then the thought, and I really feel it was a divine grace that came in solo. And so that just got my attention, like solo, oh, that's interesting. I never thought of those 2 words together before. And just that moment of interruption of feeling sad, that lifted me into a place of curiosity. And then it was like, I'm okay with solitude. I know how to do that. The other thing I'll say about solitude that I learned is the difference between solitude and isolation. Isolation is when we pull the energy in and we're pushing the world out, but it's not uplifting and inspiring for us. It's not nourishing to our spirit. It's the opposite of that. We find that the more time we're in isolation, the more disconnected we feel, especially to our own highest self and to divine energy. So when you're navigating the practice of solitude, solitude is the ability to be connected in a very uplifted way, to your own highest self and to divine energy. So I will say this, I learned recently, shelter in place has really affected my day of seclusion. Now in part because my husband James is home all the time, and in the past there was a large portion of the day that it was very easy to be alone, so I have to navigate that. He's very respectful of it. It's not him, it's me, that when I'm in the company, it's harder to have energetic boundaries. We make it work, and I make it work with self-compassion. It's like, it's different, so I need to navigate that difference. Well, I will say this, I have had a few occasions since shelter in place where my solitude, I was not able to be, I was losing that uplifted, inspired in a sense of quiet, deep stillness. One of our yoga postures, Vajrasana, says, in stillness I touch my inner strength. And that's very true, that Tapasya and austerity are about finding our way deep inside. So seclusion is a practice of that. Well, on these few times this has happened to me, my energy was dropping. So I was inside, I wasn't engaged in anything, but I wasn't okay in my consciousness, and I couldn't lift it. You know, I tried a few things. I'll read this, I'll meditate, I tried my basket of tools, of yogic tools, and they didn't help. So what I asked James is if I could have some spiritual satsang. Could we connect spiritually for a little bit? And he said, sure. So he made the time, and we began to talk about spiritual principles, and I don't remember. I just know that was the intention. It's a little bit of spiritual counseling, really. And as soon as about 20 minutes in, there we go. That's it. Okay, great. And it just cleared the clouds. It cleared that heaviness I was feeling. And I was right back in. Now I can practice solitude. Now I can be quiet again. And it was really beautiful, right? It was, I said, and he could see it in me, I said, I feel good now. I can be quiet now. I can be silent. So part of what we do with all of our practices is self-honesty. We talked about that in the Yamas. Look at yourself and what you need, and be careful about being too hard on yourself with any of these practices, demanding too much. That's not the way. Keshava gave a beautiful talk today where he said the whole practice of God is an invitation, right? It's not an imposition. So practice that yourself with the teachings, with the niyama of austerity, because it can be tricky, right? You're weeding out, as it says in the reading, those things that aren't serving you. Do that as much as possible with a gentle spirit, with a sense of kindness and compassion. And see this week, is there anything you can remove? And maybe you've already made that dedication, you've already found, you've already removed from your life that which doesn't serve you. If that's the case, you may not need to find anything else. See if you can relate to that in an uplifted way, right? With a sense of ease, with a sense of blessing. That's what happened to me in that moment of so low, so low solitude. Okay, me and God, I'll go back and I'll be with God. And that'll be okay. So see if you can find your own way with that this week, and see what happens, see what comes to you. Okay, dear souls, let's take a moment and let's just sit with that for a moment, right? What does that mean to call God in? Shanti today in Sunday service, in our meditations, she asked us to call to God. And that's part of what we're practicing, is this partnership, this companionship, that then what we're doing, solo is divine solitude. Right? It's bringing God with you in everything that you do. And then it feels very, very different, not so heavy, not so hard. Okay. Deep breath in and out. Wishing you a beautiful week.